Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Facts and Fallacies, episode 229. I am your host, Cameron English. Here, as always, joined again by a special guest. And I say again because it's been years since I've had you on a podcast, but I'm talking about Dr. Cami Ryan, and I'll let her introduce herself, but she's the social sciences lead for Bayer Crop Sciences. And when I have a question about how do you communicate science or how do you get around some weird technical point that's hard to discuss with your neighbor or your friend, I go to Cami and I look at Cami's work because it's really, really helpful. So with all of my blathering out of the way, welcome to the show, Cami. How are you?
I'm great, Cameron. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to be here. Yes, social and behavioral scientist. That's kind of how I identify. I have been working in industry now for almost 10 years, and I was the first, and I think kind of the only with that kind of title. I think what the industry's come to realize over the past few years is that these are things we need to look at. The social factors, the other factors, of course, are still really important. But the social factors really are about if the public doesn't like what we're doing, then science doesn't get to do what it wants to do or it needs to do to get things done. So connecting the dots there is really important. So that's a big part of my job.
It's really important. And as we'll talk about in these stories, it's really key to figure out how you communicate stuff, because it's not about, and we've talked about this on the show ad nauseum. It's not just about, I've got the statistics, I've got the data, and you're stupid, and let's all be pro science, right? It's much more nuanced than that. It's almost sales in a way, because you're trying to convince people of something. So, we've got these three stories, and they all have this very heavy science communication component. So let me introduce these, and then you're going to lay out some, I guess we could call them ground rules or maybe just guidelines that I think will help inform the discussion today. So first up, debunking Dunning-Kruger. It's widely believed that the less you know, the more you think you know. Does everyone think they're better than average? Next up, simplistic anti-biotech narrative. Companies lie, activists are outraged, regulations are tightened further, companies lie again, wash, rinse, repeat. It's a very beautiful headline over there at GLP. And then finally, our good friend Vandana Shiva is back, and this one's called Queen of Green Social Justice or Reckless Green Revolution Rejectionist. Who is the real Vandana Shiva? Answer at 11. Okay, so before we get into this first story, Cami, this is by a psychologist, I believe, or mathematician, excuse me, named Eric Grays, originally writing at The Conversation. And before we talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect and these really interesting nuances to this research he's talking about, kind of outline this paradigm for us that you wanted to clue everybody into.
Well, as you and I often engage about or talk about, even if it's online, is scientific integrity. And sometimes when people think about scientific integrity, they're thinking about, for example, what's going on in the lab. Well, it's broader than that. Science is what it is. It's a process. It's a way of thinking. And a lot of people want to criticize it. Some people, you will say they're anti or they're pro or whatever. The reality is, science itself and the process of science is really kind of supposed to be value free. It's the human element that gets it going off into different directions. So when we think about scientific integrity, there's a few things I think are important for us to cover if we have time today. So publications and peer review. I mean, we'd probably do a whole show on that. There is media as the mediator between science and society and what can happen there. Mis and disinformation and litigation have all kind of devolved into an industry unto themselves, and that plays into this. Different incentives can interpret science differently for different gains. And then after all of this, you've got all of this mess in there. You also have all of these things that impact public perceptions, which in turn shapes public policy. So it's a value chain in scientific integrity and all the different facets that can impact scientific integrity.
That's really good. And I think as we're going through these stories, this will come out very clearly, these various aspects of the discussion. It's not just in the lab. Of course, our friends, the lawyers, are involved. The media is involved. I mean, there's so many competing interests here. So just keep this in mind as we go. So let's jump into this first story from the conversation. So if you're not familiar, everyone out there listening, you probably are. But if you're not, the Dunning-Kruger effect, I believe it was originally developed in the 1990s by a team of psychologists. And based on some study, or excuse me, some tests that they had college students perform, they came to the conclusion that people tend to overestimate their knowledge of a topic or their ability as their skills decline, right? So the less you know, the more you think you know. And there's been lots of studies done since this original research, and it's sort of become, I don't know, it's almost like it's just a part of human nature that everybody does this. And this story we're talking about by Eric Gaze, he's a mathematician, and he's saying, well, there may be some oversimplifications, and it looks like the modeling they used to come to this conclusion was wrong. And one of the way that they did this is they repeated these experiments, these original experiments from the 90s, but they used randomly generated data from fictional people instead of real college students. And essentially what they found, and Cami, you can elaborate on this because this is right up your alley, but essentially what they found is that they could reproduce this randomly. And essentially, and this was the key quote, I thought, they said nearly 80% of unskilled students were fairly good at estimating their real ability or their real knowledge. So I don't want to say this debunks the Dunning-Kruger effect. That seems to be what he's going for, but maybe it's a little more complicated than simply saying uninformed people think they know more than they do. What's your take on this here?
Well, I mean, I always think that this is the problem with interpretation of science, period. I love the Dunning-Kruger story, and most interesting is the story behind the story, but we'll get into that later. But the thing is that that's what we often do. We take a single study, we extrapolate what we want from it, and then it kind of can sometimes get it embeds itself in some form of social psyche, and then it just keeps going, right? I often quote Dunning-Kruger. I often, put it out there because it's something that a lot of people are familiar with. But is it the perfect study? No, of course not. Because the other thing that they found out in that was not only that those that know less think they know more, but those that know more often underestimate how much they actually do know. So there's this flip that Dunning-Kruger found out in that. So I'm not surprised that other studies come out and find other things, because often what we do is when we're doing a scientific experiment, we wrap our arms around something to study it. So it's got boundaries. You can't do everything. So this is what science is about. Someone else does another study, finds out something else. But I want to talk about this Dunning-Kruger thing, because I think there's a whole other part of this that's really interesting that I've come across, especially since COVID. So you get a bunch of these really brilliant medical experts that are out there, talking and debunking misinformation. It's really great. And I follow a lot of them on TikTok. And one of the things that was making the rounds in COVID around TikTok, and there's a lot of crazy on TikTok, is that, you need to take a shot of Roundup to, that'll help you with next to the ivermectin, that's which we know, no bueno, don't do that. So anyway, one of these really brilliant medical communicators, young doctor, I follow him still, he's amazing. He gets on there and he goes, look, this is not good. You don't take this. This is bad. He said it's an organophosphate and it's poisonous. I pushed back on him. I made a comment. I said, Dr. Michael, you know what? You're right. We shouldn't be drinking Roundup. But I said, it's actually not an organophosphate. It's an organophosphonate. So I think the other problem that we have as experts, those of us that are experts, sometimes, even though we may underestimate our own knowledge in our own spaces of expertise, sometimes I think we know more about what's going on in other people's sets of expertise. And I think this is why we have to do more interdisciplinary work and talk to one another. But in that case, I pushed back on Dr. Michael, and he was really, really good about it. He come back and he goes, you know what? I got it wrong. And we had a little conversation. I said, well, did you get it wrong because it was out of the IARC monograph of 2015? And he goes, well, yeah, actually. And so it was all miscategorized in that monograph, and that was never retracted. That was never edited or changed, and it's still out there. So there we go. We got a piece of scientific misintegrity that is out there that still continues to be out there, and that's really an important piece of this, because as a medical expert, how you treat someone who's ingested an organophosphate versus an organophosphonate is completely different.
Yeah.
You get that wrong, and public health is at risk.
Yeah. That's a very, very good point. I don't know if there's an actual phenomenon here. Maybe you can clue me into that. But what seems more likely to me is that people learn a little bit about a given topic, and because they are confident in their abilities in their own sphere, then they go, well, okay, I've read about a vaccine, or I've read about this pesticide. You know, I looked up a study. I can speak with confidence about this. They may not say that, you know, publicly or consciously, but I think that's what's going on, because it's happened to me before too with certain things. Because as a journalist, I'll write something, and as you research it, you start to get more confident, but you have to check yourself and go, okay, I need to run this by somebody who is a toxicologist or whatever the subject is. And that's really helped me over the course of my career, because if you just go out on the internet and you just start blathering, the odds that you're going to say something foolish are very, very high. So what's your take on that? I think that, I don't know if that is the Dunning-Kruger, if it's related, but what do you think?
Well, I don't know. It's a version of. So is it about more or less knowledge, more or less expertise? Rather, in this case, you know, it's about scope of knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can't know all the things.
Right.
None of us can, no matter how expert. So this means, in this complex world with these complex problems that we want to address, we got to start talking to each other, and we got to talk to each other outside of our areas of expertise. We have to engage in other ways, and we've typically just kind of operated in silos. That's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And that just doesn't work anymore. And I think the other thing that's being impacted, there's two things going on. One, I think what we're finding is, like, for example, when the IARC monograph came out in 2015, it was published in The Lancet, which is a medical journal. And they're talking about basically agricultural chemistries, right? So outside usually of what maybe a journal like that would publish on. So are they getting appropriate peer review? Probably not. Right. You know, and it happens in other spaces as well. So as we move towards what I think is a good thing, interdisciplinary, start exploring these things, start cutting across these boundaries. But we have to make sure we have proper peer review in place. And we're already resource poor from a peer review perspective. And that is another added problem to all of this.
Yeah, that reminds me of it's a real weird development I've seen, that in some industries and some scientific disciplines, there's a push in some cases to exclude certain researchers from publishing and participating in the peer review and the academic research process. And this is concerning because a lot of times, and you've seen this a lot over your career, I'm sure you'll have sort of like an activist subset of people in a given field. We see it a lot with pesticides, where you have people, they have some relevant expertise, but then they try to push everybody else out of the conversation. And they say, you can't publish this. This is industry funded. And this is, you know, this guy's whatever, right? Like, you attack the reputation of the people involved. And as a result of that, oftentimes you are excluding people that have the expertise you need to properly review articles or to conduct the research appropriately. And as a result, I think everyone suffers, right? I mean, as you mentioned, public health can suffer when there's misinformation related to a pesticide. But I mean, the body of science that we have is actually less informative because of these sorts of steps that some journals are taking.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, they're having a rough time too, because they don't necessarily have the funding or resources, which makes it more difficult. But yeah, you always have that bias in there, which is problematic. I mean, I have been my work has been rejected a few times because I work for industry. You know, you kind of come to expect that might happen, which is unfortunate, because from my perspective, I've worked in the public sector as a public sector researcher, and also as a researcher in a company. And we do good work, and we have resources, and we have access to good data platforms and things like this. We could do things that are quite good. And I think we just, in order for science to really kind of move forward, we have to look beyond our own personal bias. Everybody has bias. Everybody does. You know, I do, the activists do, we all do. But if we really want to do good science, we have to start partnering together, start working together, because we can learn from one another. And I think then we're able to solve some of these issues that we claim to want to solve, because I think we all want the same thing. We're just going at it in different directions.
Yes. And as simple as a solution that is, it's really difficult to implement because a lot of times we don't want to work together. I mean, you'll hear people say what you just said, which is, bias is a real problem. The people I disagree with are really biased, and that's why we can't get anything done, right? So it's like, even in acknowledging the solution, you don't really want to implement it because, I don't know, cognitive dissonance. It's really uncomfortable to sort of say like, all right, I guess we can collaborate, and I see it everywhere. It's a real problem. So I think this is really good. If we can all remember that we all have limitations on our understanding, especially if it's outside our expertise. And if you're a
And that's
layperson,
the whole notion of human element, right?
Yeah.
As soon as we get the human element in there, that's where things can go wonky.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the best way to push back your own biases in something like this is just focus on good science. If you focus on good science, and that's very general, it sounds kind of fluffy, but if the focus is on doing good science, then I think it's easier to go, I got to move this aside because I have to hit this goal. And that maybe helps a little bit. Maybe I'm being a bit idealistic, but that's where we should be aiming for.
Somebody's got to be idealistic because there's too many cynics, there's too many utilitarians. Everyone's just, because that's good, right? I don't want to live in a world where people are ignorant of this stuff. So in any case, yeah, go read this article at The Conversation, go look into the Dunning-Kruger effect. And ironically, I guess it's sort of a great example of how, there's disagreement in the literature. There's people that don't reach the same conclusion, even though they have the same expertise, so we're all learning as we go. So check that out. But in the meantime, let's move on to this next story. This is by a good friend of ours named David Zarek. He's writing for the Genetic Literacy Project here. And I'm going to read the title again because I just love it. It says, simplistic anti-biotech narrative. Companies lie, activists are outraged, regulations are tightened further, companies lie again, wash, rinse, repeat. I call this the Aaron Brockovich theory of science communication. And you see this over and over and over, and we'll get into the lawyers involved here too. But the basic idea is, right, there's a scrappy single mom and an activist, and she's got this lawyer, and they're going to take on PG&E or big fossil fuel or whatever, and they're going to expose the conspiracy. And then the regulators are going to finally do what they should have done all along. That's Aaron Brockovich in 12 seconds.
A good narrative, though. I love a good narrative.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's movie. I love it.
Yeah.
It's a great movie.
It's a sexy story, and I get the appeal of it as a journalist, right? Because everyone gets into that field and is like, I'm gonna break it, right? I'm gonna topple the bad guys. Everyone has that sort of, and you can see it in a lot of reporting when people are, like baby powder was a great example, right? You would see these stories of these journalists and like, we went over all of these internal documents, and it's like the most benign, boring academic stuff where scientists are talking about, this or that or whatever. In any case, Zarek's point here is that this is deliberate in many cases. You have activist groups, you have tort lawyers, and you have, in some cases, politicians and regulators who are all on the same page. And you end up with this regulatory environment that almost, I don't want to say it causes, but it encourages misbehavior in industry. Right. So we're sort of left with like when you start with the Aaron Brockovich theory, as I like to call it, the implication is like there's just bad, greedy people, and they're just bad and greedy and evil, and they just want all the money, and they don't care if your babies die in the process because they just love money and they want people to die of smoking or whatever. It's this sort of cartoonish understanding of human nature, I think. So Zarek is combating this, and he says sometimes we put regulations in place that encourage bad actors to behave the way that they do. And he's not justifying the behavior. And he gives the example of prohibition. And he says, in 1920, the United States outlaws the production and sale of alcohol, which was foolish for one thing, because everyone liked to drink and there wasn't widespread support for this. And so as a result, you had the criminal element come up, namely Al Capone is the biggest name in this. And they're manufacturing the stuff, they're distributing it, and alcohol is everywhere. It did reduce drinking for a time, but it came at the cost of very, very high increases in violent crime. And so Zarek uses this as a comparison, and he says, you put industries in positions where the regulations are like, you either outright ban their product, which generates a black market. We see that over and over, or you put absurd regulations in place that they can't possibly comply with. And so they're left with two options, which is leave the market and right, your company goes out of business, your entire industry shuts down, maybe, or you comply with these, you try to work around these regulations, and you're technically breaking the law at this point. And this is what we saw a few years ago with Volkswagen, where in order to stay in California, they started cheating the emission standards. And of course, that's bad. I want to make clear, breaking the law is not good. Don't break the law. Don't drink pesticides. Don't break the law. There's your 2 pieces of life advice from this episode.
You only take these 2 things away from you today.
Yeah. Yeah. But in any case, Volkswagen got in trouble because they helped, or they designed their cars with software that allowed them to beat the emissions tests out here in California. But the tests were so strict and so rigorous, the manufacturers couldn't meet it. Right. And so this is the example he was giving of regulations that are driven by activism. It's deliberate. They're trying to put industry in this situation. And so, to spoil the story, he says, we need to reform the regulatory system. We don't want to break the law. We don't want to, right? That's chaos. If everyone's disregarding the law, nothing works. But we do need to reform the system. So that's my very long-winded summary. Jump in here. I think this relates really nicely to your point about litigation.
Well, that, and the other thing is, I think what the sad part of overly burdensome regulation has done is that, big companies then become the only ones that can afford to navigate all of this. And it's not so much about money. Oftentimes it's more about time. I mean, they have the time. Small and medium-sized companies don't have the time and resources to go through a long process. They got to get products to the market quicker. So I think that who loses is maybe generally what our critics or the activists forget that lose. I mean, and this is where real innovation happens. This is where there's a lot of agility in small and medium companies to kind of move ahead. Like, just think about Pairwise and, their work around gene editing. I mean, it's great. But if you have overly burdensome regulatory system, that's going to hinder innovation, especially in small and medium companies, because they can't navigate it. But even back to the whole notion of tort and litigation, I mean, I'm Canadian. I just actually moved back to Canada after 8 years in the States. And that was my big learning moment, was I did not realize that the litigation system in the US is not only different from Canada, it's different than any other litigation system in the world, but most people don't realize that. So when they see these cases come out, they just assume that could happen anywhere. And generally it cannot, but it is devolved into quite a huge industry down in the States, like multi-billion-dollar industry down in the States, where this is how these actors make money. I mean, it's a legitimate part of it. And then when you kind of dig back in the network, you start realizing that, well, are we talking about aspartame? Are we talking about glyphosate? Are we talking about talcum powder? And then they all kind of go back to the same kind of hub and network. Mm-hmm. And, most people don't know that story either. Actually, John Antime wrote a really good piece the other day on that. So in GLP, which was very, very good background in all of those things in litigation. But yeah, it's quite fascinating. And the average Joe, my sister, my cousin, my husband even doesn't even know these stories. So it's just really interesting when you actually dig into the story a little bit more. But we also don't want to know it's almost like we like the boxes to be like this, very simple. And I think that that's where David's headline works really well, because, oh, I can't deal with this messy story. And maybe from a journalist perspective, Cameron, you have a different idea. But even journalists, they're incentivized differently. They want the story. So digging into this stuff takes a lot of work. That investigative journalism takes courage, time, and all the rest of it. And I don't know that all journalists have that. So fitting things into little boxes is just easier.
That is 100% true. I don't even know. I mean, I've done lots of science journalism. I don't really consider myself a journalist because I just don't have any commonalities with a lot of people. I think one of the issues that's not discussed often, at least in our space, is that a lot of people that work in journalism, they have their own ideological commitments and they have their own assumptions. And sometimes those are right, sometimes those are wrong, but you can see that that clearly guides the coverage. So on an issue like glyphosate, it's a great example because, someone like you, someone like me knows this issue backwards and forwards, right? It's pretty clear that we have no evidence that this causes cancer. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. I don't know how many thousands of studies we have to do. But in any case, you'll see still reports from major outlets, and they'll say, the EPA says this doesn't cause cancer, but the International Agency for Research on Cancer, an independent arm of the World Health Organization, they make it sound like there's this ongoing debate and there's this uncertainty, and then there's these secret emails that you can actually read online, and they're not scandalous at all, right? There's all of these different avenues of discussion, and I think you're right. It just sort of gets compressed into this tight, neat little narrative. And I think that happens because people have assumptions about, industry, as David's talking about in the story. Industry is just kind of bad. They make stuff that we use, but they like money and they're greedy. I'm not greedy because I'm me and I'm awesome, and I think that just compresses the story.
Everybody wants a villain. They got to
Yes.
have a villain.
Yeah.
And then they got to have a hero, because you can't have a villain without a hero and vice versa. But I think that that's what the whole world, like our media and our communications world has really transformed and evolved over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And this is my conclusion. I mean, the scale of it is just too crazy. We can't, quote unquote, police it. And I'm really not convinced that we should do that, right? But what it comes down to is the individual. The individual, you and me and everyone else, has to arm ourselves as best we can to think critically about the information in front of us, because that's probably not going to change. Misinformation is not going to go away. Disinformation is not going to go away. There are people that can monetize it and can benefit from it. There are litigators that'll weave their way through it. It just is what it is. It's not going to go away. So it's on us to look after ourselves and what's going on up here. But it's not natural for us as human beings.
Yeah.
It's not natural for us to think critically. We have to learn that. And we also have to learn how to consume information.
That's very, very helpful insight. And it ties into our last story really, really well. This is by Dr. Henry Miller, another good friend of ours. It's kind of weird when you're constantly covering the work that all your friends and colleagues do, because they're the only people talking about this. But Dr. Henry Miller with the American Council on Science and Health. And the story is called Queen of Green Social Justice or Reckless Green Revolution Rejectionist. Who is the real Vandana Shiva? Just real briefly, if you're not familiar with this woman, she's originally from India. She's a philosopher. She, on occasion, has portrayed herself as a physicist, which she is not. And she seems to believe every strange idea that has been put out into the ether in the last 30 years. So she thinks the COVID vaccine actually killed more people than the virus itself. She seems to think that glyphosate causes cancer. She seems to think that Bayer came up with this technology to sterilize farmer seeds all over the world so they can control the food supply. At one point, she got into this theory that GMOs caused mutations in animals in China, and then they spread the virus, which became COVID. Like, really strange stuff. And the reason it ties in really well, I think, is to what you were saying, is that she gets endorsements and she gets speaking engagements with very reputable universities and very high profile, I guess you could call them pro-science or pro-education institutions. that otherwise will take a firm stance and they'll say misinformation is a critical problem in our democracy. Bah, 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 bah. And then the next week they turn around and they give her $100,000 to speak for 2 hours about some goofy concept like earth democracy, or, like buzzwords, regenerative ag and all this silliness. And so that poses a problem for people like you and me and for the general public, because the institutions that you're supposed to rely on, academic universities that put out state-of-the-art research on all these different topics, you're supposed to be able to trust these folks to guide you, and they're endorsing her work. And that's alarming. And so that's what Henry's talking about here. This is actually an open letter that he and several other scholars wrote to an organization in the UK called the Unheard Club. And they point out, they said, look, you present yourself as this pro-science institution, and ostensibly your operations are ethical and you're really trying to do good. So why in the actual hell are you bringing this woman who spreads lies? And as we've talked about on the show, like in Sri Lanka, going all organic as they did recently devastated their economy, and it left a lot of people hungry and really, really pissed off. And they ran the president out of the country, and you had this like social chaos unfold very, very quickly. And that was her doing, because the government said, yeah, let's take her advice. Now, the scientists in the country were like, look, this is dumb. Don't do this. Here's everything that's going to happen. And they totally disregarded their own experts, and they went ahead with this, and we saw the results. So there's real problems here. But again, very eager to get your insight here as the social scientist.
Well, let's step back from all this, because these are stories that I'm familiar with. But the reality is, back to this whole notion of media, social media, and our kind of communications, mass communications world. We have, as a society, devolved into being hungry for that which is outrageous, which makes us feel outrage. We are very, very attracted to shock jocks and shockumentaries, and we like people like this. So when the universities bring these individuals in, I don't care who they are, most of the time they're responding to demand. So I'm back to the individual. We are always going to be dealing with people, articles, things, movements, whatever. I think we have to start thinking more critically as individuals about the information we consume. And it's unfortunate this happens, because what you see is people that can tell a story, a very compelling one, and it gets legs. I mean, let's face it, science is not always very exciting. In fact, it's kind of boring. I mean, I would have loved to have said before I became, I started researching that I was going to solve some world problem with my work. But you start going through that and you go, nah, I'm just another social scientist. That's who I am, and it's great, and I love my life, but I'm not going to solve any of the big problems, right? Yeah. That's not how things necessarily work. But that's what we want. We want a hero. We want a hero standing up there telling them who the villain is and how they rescued the victim from the villain. And these are the stories that we're hungry for. And I guess Hollywood no longer is enough, because now we've got it in real life.
Liza and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about RFK Jr., as we are wont to do these days, because he's in the news constantly and there's all this ferocious debate over the guy. But he put out a video on Twitter where he was doing push-ups shirtless, and the caption on the video was, "Gearing up for my debates with President Biden."
Oh, I missed that one.
Oh, you're probably better off. But I observed when we were talking about this that intellectually, I know this guy is foolish, and I know what he's trying to do here. This is a very machismo, let's go, Mr. President. But at the same time, I laughed at it and I went, that's kind of badass that he's doing that. Like, he's just sort of, it's like he's admitting that the debate between noble statesmen over tax policy is done, right? This is not what voters care about. It's more like, I'm the man, I'm going to knock down the establishment. Look how strong I am. And there's something, I think it's inherently appealing about that to a certain extent. And I think that's why he resonates with so many people. And I think, as you were just saying about Shiva and some of these other people that we talk about a lot, like Mike Adams and Joe Mercola and Steve Kirsch and all these guys, I think they have captured that narrative really, really well, in that they're saying, you can't trust the establishment. Here's examples of them lying to you. I'm the truth teller. I'm fearless. Follow me. And I think there's just something in our, back in our lizard brains where we're like, follow that guy. He knows what's up, and that's what we're up against, I suppose.
Well, 100%. And yeah, it's interesting. My son-in-law really likes Kennedy, and we have some interesting conversations. And I do push back and I say, well, actually, Kennedy, or if you think about Dr. Oz, which is really interesting, when they come into the political space and they're all of a sudden, pushing forward in those spaces, people will conveniently forget about, for example, Dr. Oz was throwing agriculture under the bus left, right, and center on his daily talk show. But meanwhile, he's out shaking hands with farmers in Pennsylvania. And I'm going, did you guys forget what he was doing before? So we like to look at people in boxes. Well, I like him now, or I like her now because she's saying what I want her to say. She's supporting my beliefs, or he's supporting my beliefs. But the reality is integrity, we're talking scientific integrity, but let's just talk about integrity in general. What does that mean? That means it comes down to human behavior. And if there's no integrity in the human behavior, why are we going off in these different directions? Why do we follow these paths behind these people? It's just a fascinating observation of human behavior, just watching all of this come down and what people migrate towards in terms of leadership.
So when we talk about integrity, I don't know if there's a great solution. I think you're on to it when you talk about individuals just taking responsibility for the info they consume, because it seems to me that like people like Oz and Kennedy and who insert bad character here, they're just responding. I think you said this earlier. They're sort of responding to a demand that's out there, so if there isn't a public that will listen to, something that's outright fallacious, like the COVID vaccines were deliberately engineered to harm people, if there's no audience for that message, just as an example, then people will stop promulgating that. They'll stop writing ebooks about it, and they'll stop tweeting about it, So I guess the short story is, or the short answer is, there's no way to ensure integrity in people that are high profile, personas out there like the Kennedys of the world. But I guess we just have to stop taking an interest in that stuff, and then maybe we'll get hopefully to a more ethical society. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. It's a bit of a holy grail. Like, who'd ever thought that this was going to be the holy grail, right? Yet here we are. You and I aren't going to be here in 100 years, but people like us, presumably these kinds of careers and research interests will evolve over the next 100 years. But I always wonder, how are they going to study and write history as it is now, right? We're going to understand that things are going to evolve over the next few decades, but really, are they going to look back and go, wow, man, they got sucked down some weird spaces back then, and just examine us in our human and social behavior. I just think it's very interesting. And yes, you're right. This is the problem, though, that what we've done in the past is we kind of talk ourselves into going, okay, no, this will pass. I'll just keep quiet, and it'll go away. The misinformation will go away. I think we have to start, like, at least a company like ours, and we're moving in that direction, where you kind of look at mis and disinformation as another part of the competitive landscape. Because if we think of, as a company or any company or organization, the people are the big assets. Yes, the products are great, but you don't get the products without the people. Like, the people are the asset. And if there's competition for expert knowledge out there, and it's based on mis and disinformation, or it's produced by vendors of mis and disinformation, it's kind of a part of the competitive environment. So maybe if we flip the narrative about how we look at all these challenges out there as organizations and learn to anticipate what they're going to be, then maybe we can mitigate and manage them better. Not perfectly, but better. But again, back to your point, like I think we as individuals have to take responsibility for our own brains. I mean, we have to learn, like, if we want to get in shape and we want to be in good physical condition, we have to go out and run. We got to jog, we got to lift weights, we got to do all the things. We don't just sit there and it comes. You have to learn your physicality. You have to learn this, and you have to learn how it works. And you have to understand what triggers you, what makes you think the way you do, and what maybe triggers that fight or flight response, because that fight or flight response is what drives our behaviors, and also it influences how and what we consume in terms of information.
Oh, that's a tall order. And I think that the comparison to exercise is really true, because at least in my experience, when you start going to the gym, for example, or you start a new diet, the hardest part is the first 2 or 3 weeks, right? Because you're trying to reformulate how you live, really, right? You're using muscles you haven't used in a long time. For a lot of people, that, I mean, because you have Netflix and you have social media and you have fast food on every corner, right? If you have enough money to function, to pay your bills, you really don't have to think that hard about anything these days. And that's a real problem. And one thing, and I'm curious to get your take on this, this is one of my problems with the whole fact checker revolution, is that in many cases, these websites and these organizations that are committed to rooting out misinformation, or however you want to phrase it, their response in so many ways is, well, we got a quote from the CDC, or we talked to, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and they say this is false. And all the studies prove that, whatever conclusion we think is right is actually right. And they don't actually encourage people to investigate or to think, or really even explain. And there are exceptions, but they don't even really want to explain, why is this a conspiracy theory? Explain it to me. Why should I not listen to this person? Why are they, part of the disinformation dozen or whatever? And that does bother me, because in some cases, the folks are talking about, like Kennedy, and again, I wholesale reject his outlook on the world, but sometimes he says individual things that are correct. And I think if you swipe those things aside and you say, forget everything this guy says, if someone goes and looks into if he cites one study correctly and you go, hey, he's right about that, that piece of data is correct, and these people are telling me not to listen to him whatsoever, that's a problem. So in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is, it seems to be that there's some institutional changes that need to take place in order to properly incentivize people to sort of think critically and develop a real understanding of some of these issues.
Well, we're inherently lazy, right? Like I think we are up here where we don't want to think. And like you say, it's a muscle, you have to condition it. So if we think of some of these intermediaries that are trying to help us fact check, so to speak, maybe the most important thing, as you say, is we just have to learn to think. We don't want someone to just hand us, a personal trainer to say, well, in 2 weeks, you'll be done. You're like this. No, it's a continuous process. It is an exercise. And every time you're doing something, you're learning more and more about your own body as you try to move towards your health goals. It's the same up here. Yeah. And it should always be changing. And I think that people have to get joy in using the muscle. And maybe we just don't want to, because maybe we're a little lazy. I get intellectually lazy too. We all do. But that's the tough part.
It's funny, because there's sometimes where I don't want to look something up, and I don't want to read, and I just want to let cable TV wash over me. Like I want to put on a show I've seen 1,000 times, and that's fine. Like as as relaxation, that's totally fine. But I think in many cases, if you have the choice between figuring out if something you believe is really true, you go, nah, I'm just gonna leave that. It's fine where it is. And that's a real problem. I don't know. It's just, there's so many times on the show, we just don't have an answer to something like this. So
I just think it's a process. And the thing is, we're not just experiencing it as individuals, we're experiencing it as societies, like different societies, different clusters of people in different ways, because networks and personal networks matter to us so much. And no one wants to get voted off the island. Let's be real. So, sometimes you just kind of step back and you don't say anything, or you feel like you should have said something and you walk away with regret. Yeah, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So, did I lose you?
Nope, I'm still here. I cut off my video because you froze, so I thought that might fix it. There you go. You're good. You're good.
Oh.
Just keep talking as you were. We'll edit it.
Oh, I just said it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think sometimes we want things faster and sooner than actually they get there. But it's a process, and the human race has to work towards evolving further, because that's what we have been doing. That's what we'll continue to do.
Yeah. Yeah. One final thing before we go. You keep talking and I keep thinking of other things I want to ask you about, but another thing I've noticed, and I haven't looked into the research on this at all, but I've seen it in people in my life, family and friends. They want the joy or the whatever boost you get from having an opinion on a subject and being right and winning an argument, but they don't want to do the legwork that we were just talking about, So, and again, whatever. I love my mom to death. She's a great mom, but like on the aspartame stuff, she saw the news that's been coming out and she was like, I knew it. I knew that stuff was bad for me, Now, as great as my mom is, I know she's not going to read IARC's monograph. I know she's not going to go onto PubMed and look through, a bunch of meta-analyses. She just kind of wants this validation that this thing she's inclined to believe is true. So, and I don't know if there's an answer to that, but I think that's an interesting aspect of the discussion too, is that people want to be involved in these debates and they want to be right. But a 500-page book about the chemistry of artificial sweeteners, like, no thanks.
I don't even want to read that. I think at the end of the day, and I have a girlfriend that thinks aspartame is the devil, and this is all there, right?
Yeah.
The reality is that your mom and my girlfriend Bev can choose not to drink it, not to consume it, and it's fine. It doesn't affect anything. The only thing that's affected here is the frustration that people like you and I have with misinformation that comes with this stuff. And then we understand what's next. Because what we did see as soon as that monograph was put out, what was it, like less than a week? And there was the litigation stuff that popped up in my feeds. It was right there. And that's what we knew it was going to happen. So that's the frustrating part. But you pointed out earlier, you said, we live in a time in the world where we have so much privilege that we have the privilege to not think.
Yeah.
Because we're not just surviving anymore. We're socially surviving, which looks a lot different, right? We're trying to, survive with all the people in our networks. So we kind of go into our own little echo chambers to survive. It's a form of social survival, but it's not like we were surviving 20,000 years ago, right? This is different.
Right.
So we're interesting. Humans are my favorite animal, but boy, we're quirky. We are a quirky bunch.
Yes, we are. Yeah, it's what keeps life interesting. Okay, so let me give you the Twitter info. So you are at Cami D Ryan on Twitter. You post a lot of great stuff there. I follow you pretty closely. There's some interesting insights in there. Is there any other place that you'd recommend folks follow you, Cami?
Well, I'm on Instagram if you want something a little bit more personal at Cami D Ryan. I'm also on TikTok as Info Wrangler. So I do a mix of stuff on there. A lot of it agricultural based, but I try to debunk mis and disinformation in kind of a weirdly abstract way, but I have a little bit of fun with it. So if you want a little entertainment and want to scroll through that for a bit, you can do that. So those are my spaces I generally work in. I'm on Facebook too, but generally Facebook and Twitter kind of come into one. So
okay, what's the Instagram handle?
Instagram is Cami D Ryan, same as Twitter.
Okay. Yeah. Well, check out Cami stuff. It's really good. And maybe that's a place you can send your mom or your friends or whatever, just to sort of,
My friend Bev still doesn't like aspartame. So
Plant a seed. That's all you can do, is just, get the information out there, and maybe it'll change somebody's mind. But in any case, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Cami, for joining us and filling in for Dr. Liza Dunn, who's off getting married this week. Congratulations. That's very exciting. Yes. Yeah. Big moment in everybody's life. Big hearts. There you go. There's the hearts. I can't do it as well, but yeah, there you go. We'll be back next week for episode 230. In the meantime, follow us on social media. It's at CamJEnglish, at Dr. Liza MD, at Genetic Literacy for Genetic Literacy Project. They put this whole thing on for us. It's their content we discuss. Always grateful to them. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.